Hashtag every civilization refused, but humanity chose to protect them. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been called at 0300 Standard Galactic Time, dragging representatives from their sleep pods and meditation chambers across 17 star systems. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zephyrian Collective smoothed his crystalline carapace as he entered the massive chamber, its walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that reflected the urgency of the situation. "The readings are confirmed," announced High Counselor Veltar, her four arms gesticulating wildly as holographic displays materialized around the central podium. "The Devourers have awakened from their 1,000-year slumber in the void sectors." A collective shudder rippled through the assembled delegates. The Devourers were legend made manifest, a species of pure consumption that had laid waste to entire galactic arms before retreating into dark space eons ago. They consumed not just matter and energy, but the very fabric of space-time itself, leaving behind regions of absolute nothingness that even light could not penetrate. "How many ships?" asked General 19 Tal of the Muntarn War Clans, his 6 eyes fixed on the tactical displays. "Initial scans suggest 12 million vessels," Veltar replied, her voice barely concealing her terror. "Each one the size of a small moon. They're moving through the outer rim systems, consuming everything in their path. Colonies, fleets, entire worlds, all simply ceasing to exist." The chamber erupted in panic chatter as delegates conferred with their home systems through quantum communicators. Ambassador Kethvar watched the chaos with growing dread. The Zephyrian Collective commanded one of the largest fleets in known space, but even their mighty crystalline warships would be like insects before such overwhelming force. "There is one option," Veltar continued, raising her voice above the din, "the Sanctuary Protocol." The chamber fell silent. Every species present knew of the Sanctuary Protocol, a theoretical emergency measure that had been debated for centuries, but never implemented. It called for the complete evacuation of all populated systems to a designated safe zone, abandoning vast swaths of the galaxy to whatever threat emerged. "The calculations have been run," Veltar said, bringing up a massive star chart. "We can evacuate 17% of our populations to the core systems. The gravitational anomalies there should provide natural barriers against the Devourer's consumption waves." 17%, whispered Ambassador THYSS of the aquatic domains. "Well, the rest? They will serve as a buffer," Veltar replied, unable to meet the eyes of her fellow counselors. "Their sacrifice will buy time for the survivors to establish defenses." The debate that followed was fierce but brief. System after system voted to implement the Sanctuary Protocol. The mathematics were undeniable. Try to defend their entire civilization would result in total extinction. Better to preserve some fragment of their peoples than lose everything. When the final vote was tallied, only one delegation had not yet responded. All eyes turned to the small alcove where the human representative sat. Ambassador Sarah Chun was relatively new to the council, her species having achieved interstellar travel only 2 centuries ago. Humanity was still considered a minor power, controlling barely a dozen systems on the galaxy's edge. "Prompted Veltar? Your vote." Sarah stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She was small compared to most of the other delegates, her simple blue uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial garb worn by representatives of older civilizations. Yet something in her bearing commanded attention. "The Human Federation cannot support the Sanctuary Protocol," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "Imposible, Scope General 19 tal. Your species lacks the military capacity to mount any meaningful resistance. This is not a matter of heroics, it is simple mathematics." Sarah nodded acknowledgingly. "You're correct, General. Our fleets are small, our weapons primitive by galactic standards. We have perhaps 10,000 warships compared to your millions." She paused, looking around the chamber. "But we've reviewed the evacuation plans, and we've identified a critical flaw." The holographic displays shifted, showing detailed population analyses and transport calculations. Sarah continued. "The Sanctuary Protocol assumes that the Devourers will be satisfied with consuming the abandoned systems and won't pursue the evacuees into the core. But There's no historical evidence to support that assumption. The gravitational barriers, Veltar began. We'll slow them, not stop them, Sarah interrupted. Your own tactical reports admit as much. The Devourers will eventually breach the core systems, and when they do, they'll find 17% of galactic civilization packed into a relatively small area. It won't be salvation, it will be the galaxy's largest feeding ground. Uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several delegates began frantically reviewing their own strategic analyses, their confidence in the Sanctuary Protocol beginning to waver. Even if your assessment is correct, said Ambassador Kethvar, what alternative do you propose? My people will not simply wait for death. Sarah activated her personal display, showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with probability matrices overlaying each system. Humanity proposes Operation Bulwark. Instead of abandoning 83% of our territory, we establish a defensive line at the threshold systems, here, and here. Red markers appeared on the map, forming a rough semicircle around the Devourer's projected path. That's suicide, General 19 Tal declared. You're talking about a defensive line spanning 3,000 light-years. No force in history has been large enough to hold such a position. Not alone, Sarah agreed. But combined, our fleets number in the hundreds of millions. If we coordinate our defense instead of abandoning our positions, we can create overlapping fields of fire, mutual support networks, and strategic depth that might actually stop them. Might, Ambassador THYSS repeated skeptically. You're asking us to risk everything on a strategy that might work when the Sanctuary Protocol offers guaranteed survival for some of our people. Sarah's expression hardened. The Sanctuary Protocol offers guaranteed survival for some of your people temporarily. Operation Bulwark offers the possibility of survival for all of our people permanently. The debate resumed with renewed intensity, but now it was different. Sarah had planted seeds of doubt about the long-term viability of the Sanctuary Protocol while offering an alternative that appealed to species' natural desire to fight for their homes rather than abandon them. One by one, however, the votes came in. The Zephyrian Collective chose evacuation over uncertain battle. The Muntaran war clans, despite their martial culture, calculated that their odds were better in the core systems. The aquatic domains, the Silicon Confederacy, the Hive networks, all chose the path of retreat. The vote is concluded, Veltar announced solemnly. The Sanctuary Protocol is approved by a margin of 47-1. Implementation begins immediately. Sarah remained standing as the other delegates began filing out, already coordinating with their home systems to begin the massive evacuation effort. Only when the chamber was nearly empty did Veltar approach her. You realize what you've done, the High Counselor said quietly. Your species has just committed itself to fighting alone against an enemy that destroyed galactic civilization once before. Not alone, Sarah replied, checking her communicator as reports began streaming in from human space. We've already received volunteer applications from individual ships and crews from every member species. Apparently, not everyone agrees with their government's decisions. Veltar's eyes widened. You're talking about deserters and rebels. I'm talking about people who believe their homes are worth fighting for, Sarah corrected. The council may have voted for evacuation, but individual captains still have the right to choose their own path. As if to emphasize her point, Sarah's communicator chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at it and smiled. Captain Zar-ADH of the Zephyrian battlecruiser Crystalline Dawn requests permission to join the human defensive line. He's bringing his entire task force, 37 ships. More messages followed in rapid succession. A squadron of Muntaran heavy destroyers, 3 Hive network bio ships, an entire flotilla of independent traders, and cargo haulers from a dozen different species, all refusing to abandon their homes without a fight. This is madness, Veltar whispered. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged, but it's our madness. And sometimes madness is the only sane response to an insane situation. She gathered her materials and headed for the exit, pausing only to add, the evacuation fleets will need time to reach the core systems safely. Operation Bulwark will buy them that time, whether our governments appreciate it or not. Veltar watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of admiration and terror. In her long career, she had seen many species face extinction. Some fought desperately and died screaming. Others accepted their fate with dignity. But she had never seen an entire species voluntarily step forward to serve as a shield for those who had abandoned them. Perhaps that was what it meant to be human. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of activity across human space. Admiral Marcus Torres, commander of the Human Federation Navy, stood in the primary command center of Luna Station, watching as tactical displays showed the massive redeployment of forces toward the threshold systems. Final count, Admiral, reported his aide, Commander Lisa Park. We have 8,847 human vessels committed to Operation Bulwark, plus an additional 3,291 volunteer ships from other species. Torres nodded grimly. On paper, it looked impressive. Over 12,000 warships preparing to face the Devourers. But intelligence reports suggested the enemy fleet numbered in the millions, and each Devourer vessel was exponentially more powerful than anything in the galactic arsenal. What about the defensive installations? He asked. Construction crews are working around the clock. We're converting asteroid mining platforms into weapon batteries, seeding the approach vectors with autonomous missile clusters, and establishing supply depots throughout the threshold systems. Park paused, consulting her tablet. The engineering teams estimate we'll have basic defensive networks online within 6 weeks. Will that be enough time? Current Devourer fleet velocity suggests they'll reach the outer edge of the threshold systems in 8 weeks, 2 days, Park replied. Assuming they maintain course and speed. Torres studied the tactical projections, his experienced eye picking out weaknesses in their hastily assembled defense plan. The human fleet was spread thin across 3,000 light-years, with significant gaps between major defensive positions. If the Devourers concentrated their forces, they could punch through almost anywhere. Admiral, called out Lieutenant Commander Rahman from the communication station. Priority transmission from Captain Steele aboard the UFS Defiant. She's requesting permission to implement the Prometheus Initiative. Torres felt his blood chill. The Prometheus Initiative was a classified research project that pushed the boundaries of both physics and ethics. Captain Elena Steele commanded the Federation's most advanced experimental vessel, and her requests were never made lightly. Put her through, Torres ordered. Captain Steele's image materialized on the main screen, her scarred face and cybernetic eye reflecting years of combat experience. Behind her, the bridge of the Defiant hummed with activity as her crew prepared for whatever desperate gambit she had in mind. Admiral, we've been running combat simulations against Devourer forces for the past 18 hours. Steele began without preamble. Conventional tactics have zero probability of success. We need to escalate to theoretical weapons. The Prometheus Initiative carries unacceptable risks, Torres replied firmly. The potential for cascading dimensional collapse is less than the certainty of galactic extinction if we fail here, Steele interrupted. Sir, we've identified 17 locations where dimensional barriers are already weakened by natural phenomena. If we can create controlled ruptures at these points, we might be able to channel exotic matter into the Devourer's path. Torres was quiet for a long moment, weighing the implications. The Prometheus Initiative involved weaponizing the fundamental forces that held reality together, essentially creating artificial black holes and dimensional tiers as tactical weapons. The potential for uncontrolled expansion was terrifying, but Steele was right about their conventional options. How long do you need? He asked finally. 72 hours to position the dimensional resonance platforms. Another week to establish the control matrices. We can have the first weapon online just as the Devourers reach the outer perimeter. Approved, Torres decided. But, Captain, if this goes wrong, we won't be destroying just ourselves. We could unravel the fabric of space-time itself. Steele's expression was grim, but determined. Better to risk everything fighting than guarantee failure through inaction, sir. The transmission ended, leaving Torres staring at star charts that suddenly seemed far more fragile than before. Around him, his staff continued their preparations, coordinating with defense forces throughout the threshold systems. None of them fully understood what they were preparing to face, but all of them understood the stakes. Meanwhile, throughout human space, ordinary citizens were making extraordinary sacrifices. Entire asteroid mining operations had been converted to weapons production. Civilian freighters were being retrofitted as ammunition supply ships. On Earth itself, massive industrial complexes that had been dormant for decades were roaring back to life, producing everything from basic supplies to exotic materials needed for experimental weapons. Dr. Yuki Tanaka stood in her laboratory deep beneath the Martian surface, surrounded by holographic displays showing quantum flux calculations that would have been considered impossible just months earlier. Her team had been working continuously since the emergency began, pushing the boundaries of human science in pursuit of anything that might give them an edge against the Devourers. The temporal displacement field is showing promise, reported her assistant, Dr. Chun Wei. If we can create a localized time dilation effect, we might be able to slow down portions of their fleet. What's the energy requirement? Tanaka asked, not looking up from her own calculations. Approximately 17% of our total industrial output for 6 months, channeled through a network of quantum resonance stations positioned throughout the defense zone. Tanaka finally looked up, her eyes red with fatigue, but bright with determination. Do it. Send the specifications to Admiral Torres and begin coordinating with the engineering teams. If we're going to make our stand, we need every advantage we can create. As word of Operation Bulwark spread throughout the galaxy, reactions were mixed. Some condemned humanity's decision as foolish grandstanding that would accomplish nothing except hastening their extinction. Others quietly admired their courage, while maintaining that the Sanctuary Protocol remained the only rational choice. But on thousands of ships throughout known space, individual crews were making their own decisions. Captain Vorel of the Aquatic Domain's destroyer Deep Current had officially been ordered to join the evacuation fleet. Instead, he found himself studying navigation charts that would take his ship to the threshold systems. Captain, his first officer asked quietly, "Are you certain about this course change?" Vorel's gill slits fluttered as he considered the question. His species had evolved in the deepest ocean trenches, where survival depended on both caution and sudden, decisive action when opportunity presented itself. The humans were offering an opportunity, perhaps the last opportunity, to fight back against an enemy that would eventually consume everything regardless. Chart a course for the threshold systems, he ordered, and send a message to Admiral Torres. Tell him the Deep Current is volunteering for Operation Bulwark. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy as the full scope of humanity's plan became clear. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were positioning themselves as a shield for the entire evacuation effort, buying time and space for billions of refugees to reach the supposed safety of the core systems. It was either the most noble sacrifice in galactic history or the most pointless gesture of defiance against inevitable extinction. In 6 weeks, they would all find out which. The first Devourer scout ships appeared at the edge of the Kepler system exactly 8 weeks and 3 days after the Galactic Council vote, emerging from hyperspace like drops of liquid darkness against the star field. Long-range sensors aboard the human monitoring station Watchdog Prime detected them immediately, but the readings were unlike anything in their databases. Contact Admiral Torres immediately, ordered Commander Sarah Okafor, the station's commanding officer. She studied the sensor data with growing unease. The scout ships registered as massive voids in space, not just dark but actually absent, as if reality itself had been surgically removed from those locations. Admiral Torres receiving your transmission. Commander, reported the communications officer. Torres's image materialized on the main screen, his command center bustling with activity behind him. What's your status, Watchdog Prime? Sir, we have visual confirmation of 3 Devourer scout vessels at the outer edge of the Kepler system. They're approximately 200 kilometers in length, but Okafor paused, struggling to describe what her instruments were telling her. Sir, they're not just ships. They're holes in space. Our sensors can detect their gravitational influence, but there's no electromagnetic signature, no thermal output, no quantum resonance. It's like looking at nothing shaped like something. Torres absorbed this information grimly. Intelligence reports had suggested the Devourers existed partially outside normal space-time, but seeing confirmation was still unsettling. Are they moving toward our defensive positions? Negative, sir. They appear to be conducting some kind of scanning operation. Wait. Okafor's eyes widened as new data streamed across her displays. Admiral, they're not just scanning. They're feeding the gas giant Kepler 7 is losing mass at a rate of approximately 10,000 tons per second. On the tactical display, the massive planet was visibly shrinking, its swirling atmospheric bands growing dimmer as fundamental matter was somehow extracted and consumed. But the Devourers weren't just taking physical material. They were consuming the quantum fields that held atoms together, the gravitational forces that maintained planetary structure, even the electromagnetic radiation that provided heat and light. How long until the planet is completely consumed? Torres asked. At current rates, approximately 14 hours, sir. Torres felt a chill run down his spine. If 3 scout ships could consume an entire gas giant in less than a day, what would happen when the main fleet arrived? Continue monitoring and report any changes. And, Commander, prepare for immediate evacuation if those ships change course toward your position. Understood, sir. Watchdog Prime out. Throughout the Threshold systems, similar reports were coming in as Devourer scouts appeared at the edges of a dozen different star systems. Each time, the pattern was the same. Emerge from hyperspace, conduct detailed scans of local space, then begin the methodical consumption of any available matter. Dr. Tanaka watched the incoming data from her laboratory on Mars, her quantum displacement calculations forgotten as she struggled to understand what they were facing. This changes everything, she muttered, highlighting sections of the sensor logs. They're not just consuming matter and energy, they're consuming the quantum foam itself. Her assistant looked up from his own analysis. Meaning they're literally eating the foundation of reality. When they're finished with a region of space, there's nothing left. No vacuum, no zero-point energy, no dimensional structure. Just absolute void. The implications were staggering. If the Devourers could consume space-time itself, then nowhere in the universe would be truly safe. The core systems might provide temporary refuge, but eventually the expanding zone of nothingness would reach them as well. Captain Steele received the updated intelligence reports aboard the Defiant as her crew worked frantically to complete the first Prometheus Initiative weapon platform. The dimensional resonance generators were operating at the very edge of theoretical limits, creating controlled microfractures in space-time that would serve as the foundation for their exotic matter weapons. Captain, this new data suggests our original targeting priorities may be incorrect, reported her science officer, Lieutenant Commander Park. If the Devourers consume dimensional structure, our exotic matter weapons might not have anything to interact with once they arrive. Steele studied the tactical projections with growing concern. The Prometheus Initiative had been designed to create artificial black holes and dimensional tiers in the Devourer's path, but if the enemy could simply consume those weapons along with everything else, their entire strategy was flawed. What's the status on the temporal displacement field research? She asked. Dr. Tanaka's team believes they can create localized time dilation effects, but the power requirements are enormous. We need to channel the entire output of 3 star systems through quantum resonance networks. Steele made a quick decision. Send word to Admiral Torres. We need to accelerate the construction timeline for the temporal displacement network. If conventional space-based weapons won't work, maybe we can trap them in accelerated time zones where they consume themselves faster than they can expand. Meanwhile, throughout human space, the massive mobilization effort continued. Every available resource was being channeled toward the Threshold systems, but now the true scope of their enemy was becoming clear. Admiral Torres stood in his command center, surrounded by tactical displays showing the positions of their defensive fleets, and felt the weight of impossible responsibility. Status report from all sectors, he ordered. Commander Park consulted her displays. Admiral, we have 11,763 vessels now positioned throughout the defensive grid, including 4,847 volunteer ships from other species. Construction teams have completed 73% of the planned defensive installations, and supply lines are functioning within acceptable parameters. What about our experimental weapons programs? The Prometheus Initiative has 2 platforms online, with 6 more scheduled for completion within the next week. The temporal displacement network is behind schedule, but showing promising test results. And, Admiral, Park hesitated. We've received a message from the Galactic Council. Torres felt his jaw tighten. Let me guess. They want us to abandon our positions and join the evacuation. Actually, sir, it's more complex than that. High Counselor Veltar is requesting a private communication. Torres considered for a moment, then nodded. Put her through to my ready room. And, Commander, make sure this conversation is recorded for the historical archives, whatever the outcome. In his private chamber, Torres watched as Veltar's image materialized, the High Counselor's usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Behind her, he could see the chaos of the Evacuation Coordination Center, with staff members frantically managing the logistics of moving billions of people across vast distances. Admiral Torres, Veltar began formally. I'm transmitting updated intelligence on Devourer capabilities. Our deep space monitoring stations have been observing their advance, and we believe your assessment of our situation may be correct. Torres raised an eyebrow. Oh, the Sanctuary Protocol assumes the Devourers will be satisfied with consuming the outer regions and won't pursue evacuees into the core systems. But recent observations suggest they don't consume randomly. They follow quantum resonance patterns that indicate the presence of organized matter and energy. Large concentrations of living beings create exactly the kind of resonance signatures they seem drawn to. The implications hit Torres immediately. You're saying the evacuation fleets are essentially creating a trail for the Devourers to follow. Precisely. And, worse, the core systems contain the galaxy's highest concentration of inhabited worlds. If the Devourers reach them, they'll find the largest feeding ground in galactic history concentrated in a relatively small area. Torres leaned back in his chair, processing this information. What are you asking of me, High Counselor? Nothing you aren't already doing, Veltar replied quietly. But I wanted you to know that several council members are beginning to understand the true nature of humanity's sacrifice. You're not just fighting for your own survival. You're the only thing standing between the evacuation fleets and an enemy that will follow them wherever they go. Any chance the Council will reconsider and commit forces to Operation Bulwark? Veltar's expression was pained. The votes have been cast, and the evacuation is already in progress. Moving billions of people across such distances requires every available ship. But, she paused, glancing around to ensure she wasn't overheard. Individual captains continue to slip away from the evacuation convoys to join your defensive line. Current estimates suggest nearly 8,000 volunteer vessels have diverted course to the threshold systems. Torres felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Then, we'll make their choice count for something. Admiral, there's one more thing. Our scientists have been analyzing the quantum resonance patterns created by Devourer feeding. We believe we've identified their point of origin. A star chart materialized between them, showing a region of space far beyond the galactic rim. At its center was a dark zone where no stars shone, no quantum fields registered, and space-time itself seemed to have been completely consumed. The null sector, Veltar explained. We believe this is where the Devourers retreated after their last feeding cycle. It's a region of absolute void, approximately 12 light-years across, surrounded by a slowly expanding zone of dimensional instability. Torres studied the chart with growing horror. How many civilizations did they consume to create something that size? Our archaeologists estimate at least 47 distinct galactic civilizations over the past 50 million years. Each time, the null sector grows larger, and the Devourers enter a longer period of dormancy before awakening again. Meaning this isn't the first time this has happened. No, Admiral. And if current patterns hold, it won't be the last. Every million years or so, they emerge, consume everything they encounter, then retreat to digest what they've taken. The galaxy has been through this cycle dozens of times. Torres felt the weight of geological time pressing down on him. Humanity had existed for mere thousands of years, their interstellar civilization for barely 2 centuries. They were facing an enemy that had been consuming galaxies since before Earth's continents had taken their current shape. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Because someone should know the full scope of what you're facing, Veltar replied. And because, despite everything, I find myself hoping you might succeed where 47 previous galactic civilizations have failed. The transmission ended, leaving Torres alone with the terrible knowledge of what they were truly fighting against. He returned to the command center, where his staff was still coordinating the massive defensive effort, unaware that they were the latest in a chain of civilizations stretching back millions of years, all of whom had ultimately failed. But as Torres watched the tactical displays showing thousands of ships taking position throughout the threshold systems, he felt something that might have been hope. Previous civilizations had faced the Devourers with individual species fleeing in panic. This time, for the first time in galactic history, multiple species were choosing to stand together and fight. It might not be enough, but it was something new. "Admiral," Commander Park called out, "long-range sensors are detecting massive hyperspace distortions at the edge of the Kepler system. It looks like the main Devourer fleet is beginning to arrive." Torres straightened, pushing aside thoughts of ancient cycles and failed civilizations. "Sound general quarters throughout all defensive positions. Signal all ships to assume combat readiness. And send a message to Captain Steele. Tell her it's time to see if humanity's madness is enough to break a cycle that's lasted 50 million years." As alarms began sounding throughout the threshold systems, thousands of crews from dozens of species prepared for a battle that would determine not just their own fate, but whether the galaxy would finally break free from an endless cycle of consumption and rebirth. In the depths of space, reality itself held its breath as two incompatible forms of existence prepared to collide. The test of humanity's defiance was about to begin. The main Devourer fleet emerged from hyperspace like a cancer materializing in the heart of healthy tissue. Admiral Torres watched the tactical displays with growing dread as contact after contact appeared on long-range sensors, each one a void in space that somehow registered as impossibly massive. "Fleet composition analysis complete, Admiral," reported Commander Park, her voice tight with controlled fear. "We're detecting approximately 847,000 primary vessels, each measuring between 50 and 300 kilometers in length. Additionally, there appear to be several million smaller craft that we're classifying as fighters or corvettes." Torres felt his stomach drop. Their intelligence estimates had been off by a factor of 10. "Any sign of defensive formations or tactical deployment?" "Negative, sir. They're advancing in a roughly spherical formation, consuming everything in their path. Current velocity suggests they'll reach our outer defensive perimeter in 47 hours. Throughout the threshold systems, the news rippled through defensive positions like a shockwave. Captain Vorel aboard the aquatic domain's destroyer Deep Current studied his own sensor readings and felt his gill slits flutter with involuntary terror. His ship was rated for combat against vessels up to 5 kilometers in length. The smallest Devourer craft outmassed his destroyer by a factor of 10. "Captain," his tactical officer reported, "the human fleet coordinator is requesting all ships maintain position and prepare for coordinated defensive fire." Vorel looked around his bridge at officers who had volunteered to abandon their evacuation assignments for this desperate gambit. Each face reflected the same mixture of fear and determination that he felt himself. "Acknowledge the order," he said firmly, "and signal the rest of the squadron. Whatever happens, we hold the line." Similar scenes played out throughout the defensive fleet as thousands of ships prepared to face an enemy beyond their comprehension. But in the depths of space, humanity's most desperate experiments were about to be tested. Captain Steele stood on the bridge of the Defiant, watching as the first Prometheus Initiative weapon platform powered up. The massive structure was built around a controlled dimensional fracture, a wound in space-time itself that had been carefully shaped and contained through exotic matter fields. "Platform Alpha is showing green across all systems," reported her science officer. "Dimensional resonance is stable, exotic matter containment is holding, and targeting systems are locked onto the leading edge of the Devourer formation." "What's our effective range?" Steele asked. "The exotic matter beam should maintain coherence across approximately 50 light seconds, but we won't know if it can actually damage them until we fire." Steele nodded grimly. The Prometheus Initiative was pure theory made manifest. They were about to weaponize the fundamental forces that held reality together against an enemy that consumed those same forces. It was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, and they wouldn't know which until they pulled the trigger. "Signal Admiral Torres that Prometheus Alpha is ready for combat deployment, and begin charging the exotic matter resonance chamber." Deep in the Martian research complex, Dr. Tanaka was making final adjustments to the temporal displacement field generators. Her original plan had been to create localized time dilation effects to slow down portions of the Devourer fleet, but the new intelligence about their true nature had forced a complete revision. If they consume the quantum foam itself, she explained to her team, then we can't trap them in accelerated time. They'll just eat the temporal distortion along with everything else. But what if we reverse the polarity? Dr. Chun Wei looked up from his calculations. You're talking about creating zones of decelerated time around our own forces? Exactly. If we can slow down local time in our defensive positions, our ships and weapons will have more subjective time to react and coordinate their attacks. From our perspective, we'll be operating normally, but from outside observers, we'll appear to be moving and thinking at superhuman speeds. The power requirements would be enormous, Chen pointed out. We're talking about creating multiple time distortion fields across 3,000 light-years. Tanaka smiled grimly. Then, it's a good thing we have 3-star systems worth of power generation and the most desperate situation in galactic history to motivate us. As the Devourer fleet continued its inexorable advance, reports began streaming in from monitoring stations throughout the outer systems. The pattern was always the same. The void ships would emerge from hyperspace, immediately begin consuming everything in the vicinity, then move on without pause or consideration for resistance. Commander Okafor watched from Watchdog Prime as the gas giant Kepler 7 finally vanished entirely, its entire mass somehow converted into nothing. Where a planet had orbited just hours before, there was now simply empty space. Not even a gravitational field remained to mark its passage. Commander, her sensor officer called out, I'm detecting something unusual. The Devourer scouts aren't just consuming matter and energy, they're leaving behind regions where the basic laws of physics appear to be different. Okafor frowned, moving to examine the detailed sensor logs. Where the gas giant had been, space itself was behaving strangely. Light moved at inconsistent speeds, quantum fields fluctuated randomly, and electromagnetic radiation followed impossible paths. It's like they're rewriting the fundamental constants of reality, the officer continued. In the zones they've consumed, the laws of physics are breaking down. This information was immediately relayed to Admiral Torres, who felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. The Devourers weren't just consuming matter and energy, they were consuming the underlying structure that made existence possible. When they finished feeding on a region, that space became uninhabitable not just because it was empty, but because the basic laws that govern matter, energy, and time no longer applied. Admiral, Commander Park reported, Dr. Tanaka is requesting immediate implementation of the temporal displacement network. She says the physics breakdowns in consumed regions might actually work to our advantage. Ow! If the Devourers are vulnerable to regions where physics operates differently, we might be able to create zones of accelerated physical laws that could disrupt their feeding process. Torres considered this for a moment. They were essentially planning to fight reality-consuming entities by manipulating reality itself. It was either the most sophisticated battle plan in galactic history or the most elaborate form of suicide ever devised. Approved. Signal all defensive positions to prepare for temporal field activation. Throughout the threshold systems, massive quantum resonance stations began powering up, creating a network of interconnected temporal distortion fields. As the network came online, crews throughout the defensive fleet reported a strange sensation, as if time itself was becoming more flexible, more responsive to their needs. Captain Maria Santos commanded a small flotilla of human corvettes positioned near the primary approach vector. As the temporal field activated around her ships, she watched her tactical displays with fascination. Her crew's reaction times improved dramatically. Their targeting systems achieved lock-ons faster than should have been possible, and their communication protocols operated with perfect synchronization. Captain, her tactical officer reported, it's like we're thinking and moving in fast forward while everything else operates normally. Our effective combat capability has increased by approximately 400%. Santos nodded, feeling the strange exhilaration of existing in accelerated time. Signal the fleet. Tell them the temporal enhancement is operational, and we're ready to show these things what happens when prey fights back. But even as humanity's experimental weapons came online, the scope of their enemy became increasingly clear. Long-range surveillance showed that the Devourer fleet wasn't just large, it was incomprehensibly vast. The 847,000 primary vessels were supported by millions of smaller craft, all advancing in perfect coordination despite having no visible communication systems. Captain Kethvar of the Zephyrian battlecruiser Crystal Dawn studied the approaching enemy formation with growing unease. His species had evolved from crystalline matrices that processed information through quantum resonance, giving them an intuitive understanding of complex patterns. What he saw in the Devourer advance was disturbingly familiar. They're not individual ships, he realized, sharing his analysis with the human fleet coordinators. The entire formation is a single distributed organism. Each vessel is like a cell in a vast body, operating according to collective instinct rather than tactical planning. This intelligence was immediately shared with Admiral Torres, who felt yet another assumption about their enemy crumble away. They weren't facing a military force in any conventional sense. They were confronting a biological entity the size of a solar system, one that had evolved over millions of years to consume entire civilizations with perfect efficiency. "Admiral," Commander Parr called out, "the outer monitoring stations are reporting massive hyperspace distortions. It looks like the Devourer fleet is preparing to transition to normal space within the outer defensive perimeter." Torres took a deep breath, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether their desperate gambit had any chance of success. "Signal all ships. Imprimant combat protocole Omega. All experimental weapons are authorized for immediate deployment upon enemy contact." "Sir," Park hesitated, "Protocol Omega includes authorization for dimensional warfare. If our exotic matter weapons destabilize local space-time, then we'll face that crisis when it comes," Torres interrupted. "Right now, our choice is between certain extinction and possible mutual annihilation. I'll take those odds." Throughout the defensive fleet, final preparations were completed. Prometheus Initiative weapons platforms powered up their exotic matter beam arrays. Temporal displacement fields reached maximum intensity. Conventional weapons systems loaded their most advanced munitions. And thousands of crew members from dozens of species prepared to face an enemy that had never been successfully resisted. As the first Devourer vessels began materializing at the edge of the defensive perimeter, Captain Steele received the authorization she had been waiting for. "All Prometheus platforms, this is Defiant Actual. You're cleared to engage with maximum force. Show them what happens when someone finally fights back." The exotic matter beam that lanced out from Prometheus Alpha was unlike any weapon ever deployed in galactic warfare. It was pure distilled reality, the fundamental forces that held atoms together and made existence possible, weaponized, and directed with surgical precision. When it struck the lead Devourer vessel, the results were spectacular. The void ship simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not damaged, but utterly removed from reality as if it had never been there. For a moment, the surrounding Devourer vessels seemed to pause, as if the distributed organism was processing the loss of part of itself. Then they adapted. The next exotic matter beam passed harmlessly through its target, the Devourer vessel somehow becoming permeable to the very forces that should have annihilated it. Within seconds, the entire enemy formation had modified its dimensional structure to become immune to humanity's most powerful weapon. "They're learning," Steele breathed, watching as her carefully planned surprise attack was neutralized with casual efficiency. "They're actually learning from each shot." Admiral Torres received the report with grim acceptance. The enemy had just demonstrated intelligence and adaptability that surpassed anything in their worst-case scenarios. But as he watched the tactical displays show the vast Devourer formation advancing toward their defensive positions, he felt something unexpected. Not hope exactly, but not despair either. For the first time in galactic history, someone was actually fighting back against the Devourers. Win or lose, they were breaking a cycle of inevitable consumption that had lasted for millions of years. "All ships," he broadcast across the fleet network. "This is Admiral Torres. We are about to engage an enemy that has consumed 47 galactic civilizations. They expect us to run, to hide, to accept inevitable defeat like everyone before us. Instead, we're going to show them what it means to face humanity. Signal all vessels, weapons free. Make them remember this day. As the first direct engagement between the Devourer fleet and Operation Bulwark began, the outcome remained utterly uncertain. But, for the first time in the galaxy's history, the unstoppable force of cosmic consumption was about to meet an immovable object of pure human defiance. The battle for the future of existence itself was about to begin. The first salvo of the Battle of the Threshold systems lit up space like a newborn star. Thousands of ships opened fire simultaneously, their combined energy output temporarily outshining the local sun. Conventional missiles, plasma beams, particle accelerators, and exotic matter projectors all converged on the leading edge of the Devourer formation. Admiral Torres watched the tactical displays with intense focus as the bombardment reached its targets. For a brief moment, it seemed as if they might actually damage the enemy. Several Devourer vessels flickered, their void black holes showing patches of what might have been conventional matter. Then, the energy simply disappeared. Not absorbed, not reflected, not dissipated. The massive barrage that should have vaporized a dozen enemy ships was simply consumed, adding to the Devourer's mass and strength. The enemy formation continued its advance without even slowing down. All weapons ineffective, Commander Park reported, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. The enemy is actually feeding on our attacks. But throughout the defensive fleet, individual captains were discovering that not all of their weapons were useless. Captain Santos aboard her corvette had opened fire with conventional missiles, watching in dismay as they were consumed upon impact. But when her crew fired their emergency flare rockets, simple chemical devices used for signaling rather than combat, something unexpected happened. Captain, the flares are actually causing some kind of disruption, her tactical officer reported excitedly. Look at this. On the display, the primitive chemical rockets were creating small, but visible distortions in the Devourer vessel's hulls. The effect was minimal, but it was the first sign that anything could actually affect the enemy. Chemical reactions, Santos breathed, understanding immediately. They can consume energy and exotic matter, but they're having trouble processing simple chemical combustion. She immediately shared this discovery with the fleet network, where it was analyzed by Dr. Tanaka's research team in seconds of accelerated time. The temporal displacement field was allowing human scientists to process information and develop new theories at superhuman speeds. It makes sense, Tanaka reported to Admiral Torres via quantum link. The Devourers have evolved to consume sophisticated energy forms and complex matter arrangements. But basic chemical reactions might be too primitive for their consumption mechanisms to recognize as valuable energy sources. What are you suggesting? Torres asked. Revert to the most primitive weapons we have. Chemical explosives, combustion engines, even kinetic projectiles might be more effective than our advanced energy weapons. Throughout the fleet, this information was processed and implemented with desperate efficiency. Ships that had exhausted their advanced munitions began firing their emergency supplies. Chemical flares, emergency rockets, even personal firearms from their security lockers. The results were encouraging, but still far from decisive. Captain Vorel discovered that his destroyer's waste recycling system, when vented directly into space, actually created small holes in nearby Devourer hulls. The organic compounds and bacterial cultures that his aquatic crew produced as biological waste seemed to trigger some kind of allergic reaction in the void ships. Signal the fleet. He ordered his communications officer. All ships with organic waste processing systems should prepare for emergency venting procedures. We're going to fight them with our garbage. Meanwhile, Captain Steele was discovering that while her exotic matter weapons were useless, the Defiant's experimental systems had an unexpected secondary effect. The dimensional fractures created by the Prometheus Initiative were being consumed by the Devourers, but the process was creating small zones of unstable space-time around each enemy vessel. That the dimensional distortions are cascading, her science officer reported. Each time they consume one of our exotic matter beams, it creates a feedback loop in their whole matrix. If we can synchronize multiple platform shots. Do it, Steele ordered. Coordinate with all remaining Prometheus platforms. We're going to overload their consumption mechanism. The coordinated strike that followed was the largest deployment of exotic weaponry in galactic history. 7 Prometheus platforms fired simultaneously at a single Devourer vessel, creating a complex pattern of overlapping dimensional fractures. The enemy ship began consuming the exotic matter as before, but the multiple intersecting distortions created an unstable feedback loop. For a moment, the void ship flickered between existence and non-existence, caught in a cascade failure as its consumption mechanism tried to process incompatible dimensional distortions. Then, with a flash of energy that briefly illuminated the entire star system, the Devourer vessel collapsed into itself and vanished. One down, Steele reported grimly. Only 846,999 to go. But the destruction of a single enemy vessel had an unexpected effect on the rest of the Devourer fleet. For the first time since emerging from hyperspace, they changed their formation. The distributed organism that controlled the vast armada had registered something it had never experienced before: the permanent loss of a component vessel. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The entire Devourer fleet began to accelerate, abandoning their methodical consumption advance for a direct assault on the defensive positions. Worse, they began exhibiting new capabilities that their previous victims had never witnessed. Long-range sensors detected massive gravitational distortions as the enemy vessels began manipulating space-time itself, creating localized warp fields that allowed them to move faster than light without entering hyperspace. Within minutes, the 47-hour timeline for enemy contact collapsed to less than 6 hours. "Admiral," Commander Park reported, her voice barely steady, "the Devourer fleet is implementing some kind of advanced propulsion system. They'll reach our outer defensive perimeter in 5 hours, 43 minutes. Torres felt his blood chill. Their carefully planned defensive strategy had assumed they would face the enemy on predictable terms, with time to implement coordinated responses to each new threat. Now, the Devourers were demonstrating capabilities that invalidated every assumption they had made. "Signal all ships," he ordered. "Implement Emergency Protocol Delta. All vessels are to converge on the primary defensive line and prepare for close-quarters combat." Throughout the threshold systems, thousands of ships began repositioning themselves, abandoning their carefully planned defensive positions for a desperate concentration of force. The elegant strategic depth they had planned to use against the enemy was collapsing into a single, massive confrontation that would determine the outcome of the entire campaign. Dr. Tanaka watched the tactical updates from her laboratory with growing alarm. The temporal displacement network was still functioning, giving human forces enhanced reaction times and coordination, but the enemy's new capabilities were stretching even their accelerated capabilities to the breaking point. "We need something completely unexpected," she muttered, reviewing every piece of data they had collected about Devourer vulnerabilities. "Chemical weapons are marginally effective. Dimensional overloads can destroy individual vessels. Biological waste causes minor disruptions. There has to be a pattern." Her assistant looked up from his own analysis. "Dr. Tanaka, what if we're approaching this wrong? Every effective weapon we've discovered has been based on primitive or biological processes. What if the Devourers have evolved specifically to counter advanced technological civilizations?" Tanaka felt a sudden flash of inspiration. "You're right. They've been consuming high-tech, spacefaring civilizations for millions of years. Their entire biological structure has evolved to process and consume advanced energy forms, exotic matter, and sophisticated technology. But they've never encountered primitive technology wielded by an advanced civilization," her assistant finished. Tanaka began frantically inputting calculations into her quantum computer. "We need to strip away every advanced system we have and fight them with the most primitive weapons imaginable. Not chemical explosives, actual combustion engines. Not energy weapons, kinetic projectiles. Not exotic matter, simple atomic fusion." The concept she was developing was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of trying to out-advance the Devourers, humanity would deliberately regress to primitive technologies that the enemy had never learned to counter. "Dr. Tanaka to Admiral Torres," she broadcast across the command network. "I need immediate authorization to implement the regression protocol." Torres's image appeared on her display, The command center chaos visible behind him. What's the regression protocol? We strip the advanced systems from every ship in the fleet and replace them with the most primitive equivalents we can construct. Steam engines instead of antimatter reactors. Gunpowder weapons instead of plasma beams. Chemical rockets instead of gravitic drives. The Devourers have evolved to consume advanced technology. They may be completely vulnerable to primitive alternatives. Torres stared at her for a long moment, processing the implications. She was asking him to deliberately cripple their entire fleet, removing every technological advantage they possessed in favor of systems that were centuries out of date. The logistics alone would be impossible, Commander Park pointed out. We can't rebuild every ship in the fleet in 5 hours. We don't need to rebuild them, Tanaka replied. We just need to supplement them. Every ship has emergency systems, backup power sources, manual controls. We activate all of those while shutting down our primary advanced systems. Throughout the fleet, the concept was being implemented with desperate creativity. Ships began shutting down their main power plants in favor of backup chemical batteries. Weapons systems were supplemented with literal cannons firing solid projectiles. Some vessels even began fabricating primitive steam-powered thrusters from their recycling systems. Captain Santos took the regression protocol to its logical extreme, ordering her crew to manufacture black powder explosives from their food synthesizers and load them into improvised cannons welded to their hull. Her corvette, previously one of the most advanced ships in the human fleet, was rapidly becoming one of the most primitive vessels in galactic history. Captain, her engineer reported, we've successfully retrofitted 6 chemical combustion cannons along our primary hull. We're also rigging the waste recycling system to function as a steam engine for secondary propulsion. What about our main systems? Fusion reactor is in standby mode, gravitic drive is offline, and all energy weapons are powered down. We're running on backup chemical batteries and manual controls only. Santos nodded grimly. They were about to test whether the most primitive technology in their inventory could succeed where their most advanced weapons had failed. Similar preparations were taking place throughout the defensive fleet. The aquatic domain's destroyer Deep Current had converted its waste processing system into a biological warfare platform, preparing to launch clouds of organic matter at the enemy. The Zephyrian battlecruiser Crystal Dawn was using its quantum resonance matrices to create simple vibrations, essentially turning their most sophisticated technology into a very large tuning fork. As the Devourer fleet continued its accelerated approach, long-range sensors began detecting something unexpected. The enemy vessels were starting to exhibit signs of confusion. Their perfect formation was developing small inconsistencies, and several ships appeared to be moving in slightly different directions than the main force. They're reacting to our technological regression, reported Commander Park. It's as if they're having trouble processing what we're doing. Torres felt a spark of hope for the first time since the battle began. Continue implementing the regression protocol across all vessels. And signal Captain Steele. I want her to try firing the Prometheus platforms at minimum power output using the most primitive targeting system she can construct. Captain Steele received the order with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. Her crew began the surreal process of replacing the Defiant's sophisticated targeting computers with manual sighting systems and mechanical calculators. When the next Prometheus platform fired, it was aimed using instruments that wouldn't have been out of place on a 20th century battleship. The result was extraordinary. The exotic matter beam, guided by primitive targeting rather than quantum-assisted precision, struck its target and created a cascade failure that destroyed not just one Devourer vessel, but 3 adjacent ships. The manual targeting had introduced random variables that the enemy's adaptive systems couldn't predict or counter. As the Devourer fleet finally reached the outer edge of the defensive perimeter, they faced something completely unprecedented in their millions of years of existence. Instead of an advanced technological civilization trying to fight them with sophisticated weapons they could easily counter, they encountered primitive systems wielded with advanced tactical coordination. The Battle of the Threshold systems was about to enter its decisive phase, with the fate of galactic civilization hanging on humanity's ability to fight a space-age war using Stone Age technology. The final phase of the Battle of the Threshold Systems began when Captain Santos fired the first primitive weapon of the engagement. Her improvised black powder cannon sent a solid iron projectile hurtling toward the nearest Devourer vessel at a mere 3 kilometers per second, pathetically slow by space combat standards, but apparently faster than the enemy could adapt to. The iron ball punched clean through the void ship's hull, creating a hole that spread like a cancer as the Devourer's consumption mechanisms tried to process what had happened. The primitive projectile had been moving too slowly for the ship's defensive systems to register it as a threat, and its simple iron construction was apparently too basic for the consumption mechanisms to efficiently digest. Direct hit. Santos reported to the fleet network. Solid projectile weapons are effective. Repeat, primitive kinetics are penetrating enemy hulls. Throughout the defensive fleet, ships opened fire with weapons that belonged to museums rather than space battles. Steam-powered projectile launchers sent chunks of raw metal into enemy formations. Chemical explosive warheads detonated against void hulls with surprising effectiveness. One enterprising Muntaran captain even rigged his ship's waste disposal system to fire garbage at the enemy, and watched in amazement as organic refuse proved more effective than his ship's advanced plasma cannons. But the Devourers were learning and adapting with terrifying speed. Within minutes of the first primitive attacks, enemy vessels began developing countermeasures. Some grew thick, conventional armor plating over their void hulls. Others started generating kinetic barriers that could deflect slow-moving projectiles. Admiral Torres watched the tactical displays with growing concern as the enemy adaptation accelerated. They're still evolving faster than we can innovate. Even our aggression strategy is only buying us time. Dr. Tanaka, working at superhuman speed within the temporal displacement field, was reaching the same conclusion. Admiral, we need to escalate the regression protocol beyond simple primitive weapons. We need to fight them with something they've never encountered in any form. What do you have in mind? Magic. Torres blinked, certain he had misheard. Come again, Doctor. Not actual magic, obviously, but phenomena that would appear to be magic to a species that has only ever encountered technological civilizations. Biological processes, quantum consciousness effects, even artistic expression used as a weapon. As if to emphasize her point, the crystal dawned suddenly, blazed with brilliant light as Captain Kethvar implemented his own interpretation of the new strategy. Instead of using his quantum resonance matrices for communication or targeting, he had converted them into what was essentially a massive musical instrument, broadcasting complex harmonic patterns directly into space. The effect on nearby Devourer vessels was immediate and dramatic. The void ships began writhing and distorting, their perfect hull configurations disrupted by the harmonic frequencies. It was as if the music was causing them physical pain. All ships with quantum resonance capabilities, Kethvar broadcast, begin transmitting complex harmonic patterns on all frequencies. The enemy appears to be vulnerable to organized sound waves. Throughout the fleet, ships began broadcasting everything from classical symphonies to death metal, from whale songs to the rhythmic chanting of ancient religious ceremonies. The cacophony should have been meaningless in the vacuum of space, but the quantum resonance systems were converting sound into fundamental frequency patterns that could affect matter at the subatomic level. Captain Vorel discovered that his species' natural echolocation calls, when amplified through his ship's communication system, created localized disruptions in Devourer hull integrity. The deep, subsonic pulses that his people used for underwater navigation were apparently devastating to entities that existed partially outside normal space-time. But it was Captain Maria Santos who made the discovery that would change the course of the battle. As her corvette continued engaging enemy vessels with primitive weapons, she noticed that her crew's performance was improving beyond what even the temporal displacement field could explain. Captain, her tactical officer reported, our accuracy rate with the manual targeting systems has improved by 340% in the last 10 minutes. That's statistically impossible. Santos studied the data, then looked around her bridge at her crew. They were operating with perfect coordination, anticipating each other's actions, working together like a single organism. It was as if the desperate circumstances had awakened something primal in human nature. It's not the weapons, she realized. It's us. We're fighting differently. She was right. Throughout the human vessels, crews were displaying capabilities that their own species had thought were lost to civilization. Enhanced intuition, perfect teamwork, the ability to anticipate enemy movements through instinct rather than calculation. They were fighting like their prehistoric ancestors, not as individuals operating machines, but as pack hunters working in perfect synchronization. This information was immediately shared with Dr. Tanaka, who felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Admiral, we need to implement the final phase of the regression protocol. We need to stop fighting like a technological civilization and start fighting like a living organism. Ow! Shut down the command and control networks. No more coordinated tactics, no more strategic planning. Let each ship and crew operate on pure instinct and see what happens. Torres felt his command training rebel against the suggestion. Military doctrine emphasized coordination, planning, and centralized control. Tanaka was asking him to abandon centuries of strategic evolution in favor of complete chaos. But as he watched the tactical displays show primitive weapons succeeding where advanced technology had failed, he made the decision that would define the battle. All ships, he broadcast across the fleet network. This is Admiral Torres. As of now, you are authorized to engage the enemy using any means you deem appropriate. Command protocols are suspended. Trust your instincts and fight like your lives depend on it, because they do. The effect was immediate and profound. Throughout the defensive fleet, individual crews began implementing tactics that no military academy had ever taught. Ships started moving in hunting pack formations, using coordinated attacks that relied on intuition rather than planning. Weapons fire became less precise, but more unpredictable, creating patterns that the enemy's adaptive systems couldn't analyze. Captain Steele aboard the Defiant discovered that when she stopped trying to use her exotic matter weapons tactically and instead fired them based on pure instinct, the results improved dramatically. The Prometheus platforms, operated by crews relying on intuition rather than calculated targeting solutions, began achieving hit rates that exceeded their theoretical maximums. But the most extraordinary development came from an unexpected source. Throughout the fleet, crew members who had never shown any psychic abilities began reporting strange sensations. The ability to sense enemy movements before they happened, to anticipate when their own weapons would be most effective, to coordinate with other ships without any communication at all. Dr. Tanaka, monitoring these reports from her laboratory, felt a chill of recognition. They're not just fighting like their ancestors. They're awakening capabilities that civilization suppressed. Humans are displaying latent psychic abilities under extreme stress. The phenomenon spread beyond the human ships. Captain Vorel reported that his aquatic crew was beginning to demonstrate echolocation abilities in space, somehow sensing enemy vessel positions through quantum fluctuations. The Zephyrian crews found their quantum resonance matrices responding to their emotional states rather than their conscious commands, creating more effective harmonic weapons than any programmed system could achieve. As these awakened abilities spread throughout the defensive fleet, the battle began to shift in their favor for the first time. The Devourers, evolved to counter technological threats, found themselves facing something they had never encountered: a space-age civilization fighting with Stone Age instincts enhanced by awakened psychic capabilities. The enemy formation, which had maintained perfect coordination for millions of years, began to show signs of confusion and disarray. Individual Devourer vessels started making tactical errors, moving in ways that exposed them to concentrated fire from multiple primitive weapons. The distributed organism that controlled the vast fleet was apparently unable to process or counter opponents who operated on pure instinct rather than logical planning. Captain Santos, now relying entirely on intuition, led her corvette in a series of attacks that shouldn't have been possible with her primitive weapons. She found herself anticipating enemy movements with perfect accuracy, coordinating with other ships through some form of telepathic connection, and achieving targeting solutions that exceeded anything her manual systems should have been capable of. All ships, she broadcast, stop thinking and start feeling. Let your instincts guide your actions. We're not fighting a space battle, we're hunting. The transformation was remarkable. Ships that had been struggling to hit enemy targets with their improvised weapons suddenly began achieving perfect accuracy. Crews that had been operating as individuals became perfect teams. The entire defensive fleet started moving like a single, vast organism dedicated to the destruction of their enemies. But the Devourers were not defenseless. As their adaptive capabilities failed to counter the new threat, they began implementing more desperate measures. Energy discharges that could vaporize entire ships, gravitational weapons that could crush vessels like insects, consumption beams that could drain the life force from living crews. The casualties were horrific. Hundreds of ships were destroyed in minutes as the enemy abandoned their methodical approach in favor of pure destruction. But for every ship that fell, the remaining vessels seemed to become more effective, as if the loss of their companions only strengthened their instinctive coordination. Admiral Torres, now fighting his own ship based purely on intuition rather than tactical doctrine, watched as the impossible began to happen. The Devourer fleet, which had numbered nearly 1 million vessels at the start of the engagement, was actually shrinking. Not quickly, and at a terrible cost, but for the first time in galactic history, the unstoppable force of cosmic consumption was being stopped. "Admiral," Commander Park reported, her voice filled with wonder. "Long-range sensors are detecting something unprecedented. The main Devourer formation is retreating." Torres looked at the tactical displays with disbelief. The enemy vessels were indeed pulling back, abandoning their assault on the defensive positions. But they weren't fleeing in defeat. They were regrouping for something else entirely. "Sir," Park continued, "they're concentrating their entire remaining fleet into a single formation. It looks like they're preparing for some kind of massive coordinated attack." As Torres watched, the scattered Devourer forces began converging into an enormous sphere of void ships, each vessel contributing its power to a growing energy field at the formation center. The readings were beyond anything their instruments had ever recorded, enough destructive force to sterilize entire star systems. "They're preparing to consume this entire region of space," Torres realized with horror. "If they can't defeat us conventionally, they're going to eat the space-time itself that we're fighting in." Dr. Tanaka's voice crackled across the command network from her laboratory. "Admiral, we have approximately 17 minutes before they complete the convergence. After that, they'll be able to consume a sphere of space approximately 50 light-years in diameter." Torres felt the weight of final decision pressing down on him. They had achieved the impossible, actually damaging and forcing back the Devourer fleet. But now the enemy was preparing to implement a weapon that would destroy not just their defensive forces, but dozens of star systems and billions of lives. "All ships," he broadcast to the fleet. "This is Admiral Torres. The enemy is preparing a final attack that will consume this entire region of space. We have 17 minutes to either stop them or die trying." He paused, looking around his bridge at crew members who had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed, then continued. "We came here to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. We came here to break a cycle that has lasted for millions of years. We came here to prove that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds." His voice strengthened as he spoke. "Today, we've shown that humans don't surrender, don't retreat, and don't accept inevitable defeat. In 17 minutes, we're going to show them what happens when you threaten everything we care about." Throughout the defensive fleet, thousands of crews from dozens of species prepared for the final phase of a battle that would determine whether the galaxy would finally break free from an ancient cycle of consumption and death, or whether the Devourers would add another civilization to their millions of years of conquest. The ultimate test of humanity's refusal to accept the unacceptable was about to begin.